The life of Clara Mae Thompson at 38 was measured in beeps, breaths, and the weary sighs of her aging parents. Her day began in the pre-dawn quiet, a sliver of gray light cutting through the blinds of her childhood bedroom. The house around her was still, holding the shallow, sleep-fragile breaths of the two people who anchored her entire existence. Long before the sun crested the sycamore trees lining their suburban street, Clara was already in motion, a silent, efficient ghost gliding through the familiar hallways. She showered, dressed in the crisp blue of her nursing scrubs, and made coffee, the aroma a lonely comfort in the sleeping house. This was her time, this brief, solitary hour before the world and her family awoke to claim their pieces of her dot at the hospital. In the controlled chaos of the cardiac ward, she was a different person. Here she was Nurse Thompson, a figure of calm authority and profound competence. She moved with a purpose that was entirely her own, interpreting the frantic language of heart monitors, administering medications that could restart a failing rhythm, and holding the hands of strangers as they navigated the terrifying landscape of their own mortality. She was good at it, exceptionally so. She could spot the subtle dip in oxygen saturation that preceded a crisis, could soothe a panicked patient with a low, steady voice, and could navigate the intricate dance of a code blue with a focus that bordered on artistry. Doctors respected her. Younger nurses looked up to her. Patients and their families saw her as a beacon in their darkest hours. It was a life of consequence, of tangible, life-altering impact. But every day at 7 p.m., that life ended. The moment she clocked out and walked to her car, the competent, respected Nurse Thompson began to recede, replaced by the familiar, heavier mantle of daughter Clara. The 20-minute drive home was a transition, a slow decompression where the acute crises of the hospital were replaced by the chronic, low-grade emergencies of her home life. The weight of this second, unseen shift would settle upon her shoulders. It had no start or end time, no scheduled breaks, and no paycheck. It was a shift paid for in time, in missed opportunities, in the slow erosion of her own dreams. She'd pull into the driveway of the modest two-story house she'd grown up in, the paint peeling slightly on the porch railing, the garden her mother once tended now showing signs of neglect. The moment her key turned in the lock, the demands began. "Clara, is that you? Your father's blood pressure cuff is acting up again." Or, "Clara, thank goodness. The remote isn't working and my show is on." The air inside was thick, with the scent of old books, lavender air freshener, and the faint, underlying smell of almost out her evening was a meticulously choreographed routine of care. She would cook dinner, a simple, low-sodium meal that her father would complain was bland. She would sort their evening medications into a rainbow of pills in a plastic organizer, double-checking dosages. She'd listen to a litany of complaints, the ache in her mother's arthritis, the plot twist of a game show, the rudeness of a telemarketer. She had twice turned down a promotion to head nurse, a position that would have meant more money, more prestige, but also longer, less predictable hours. It was an impossible choice. How could she manage a larger team at the hospital when her primary team, the two frail people in the living room, required her constant, unwavering presence? So she remained a floor nurse, competent and respected, but professionally stagnant, frozen in time by the gravitational pull of filial duty. It was, she told herself as she finally climbed into bed, her own heart a little heavy, simply what a daughter does. It was her unseen shift, and tomorrow it would begin all over again. Asterisk Saturday had a different rhythm. The air in the house, usually thick with the quiet hum of daytime television and the rustle of newspapers, was charged with a low-level, anticipatory energy. This was the day Chris called. For her parents, it was the undisputed highlight of the week, an event they prepared for as if expecting a royal visit. Her mother would put on a touch of lipstick, and her father would wear his good cardigan, the one without the small soup stain on the cuff. Clara referred to it privately as the worship hour. She would busy herself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for lunch, the rhythmic thud of the knife on the cutting board, a counterpoint to the cheerful chime of the video call connecting from a world away. There he is. Her father would boom, his face breaking into a wide, genuine smile that Clara rarely saw directed at her. On the screen, Chris would appear, framed by the sleek, minimalist lines of his Manhattan apartment. He was handsome, with their father's strong jaw and an easy, confident smile that seemed tailor-made for closing deals and charming investors. He was the golden boy, the family's emissary to a world of success and prestige they could only imagine. "Hey, folks, how's my favorite couple doing?" he'd ask, his voice smooth and practiced. The conversation that followed was always the same. Chris would speak in broad, impressive strokes about the market, about a potential merger, about a weekend trip to the Hamptons. He painted his life in vibrant colors of achievement and excitement. Her parents would hang on every word, their faces a mixture of awe and adoration. They didn't understand the intricacies of hedge funds or acquisitions, but they understood the language of success. They understood that their son, their Christopher, was a player in a game far bigger and more important than their quiet suburban life. Clara would listen from the kitchen, a ghost in her own home. She heard the pride in her mother's voice as she asked, "And the trip to London, dear? Did you have a wonderful time?" She heard her father's vicarious thrill as he said, "Tell me about that new tech stock you mentioned." They never asked Clara about her day. They never asked about the man whose life she had helped save that morning, or the scared wife she had comforted in the waiting room. Her contributions were measured in sorted pills and cooked meals. They were functional, expected, and therefore invisible. Sometimes Chris would remember she was there. "Clara, still holding down the fort?" He'd call out, his eyes flicking past the camera for a moment. "Don't let them give you too much trouble." It was a casual, almost dismissive acknowledgement, the kind one gives to a reliable piece of household machinery. She would offer a tight smile and a noncommittal murmur from the kitchen doorway before retreating back to her tasks. After the call ended, the glow would linger. Her parents would spend the next hour dissecting every word, replaying every success. It was during one of these post-call debriefings that her father, staring wistfully at the blank screen, said the words that would lodge like a shard of glass in Clara's heart. "You know," he said to her mother, but loud enough for Clara to hear, "that boy is building a real legacy. Something that will last." Clara paused, her hand hovering over the sink. A legacy. The word echoed in the quiet kitchen. Chris was building a legacy of stock portfolios and financial reports. She was building a legacy of kept appointments, managed pain, and extended days. His was a legacy that could be measured in dollars and cents, displayed on a spreadsheet for all to see. Hers was written in the invisible ink of daily sacrifice, a legacy that would vanish the moment she was no longer there to sustain it. And in that moment, for the first time, she didn't just feel tired. She felt erased. The crisis, when it came, didn't announce itself with a dramatic crash, but with a subtle change in the rhythm of the night. It was a Tuesday in late October, the air outside crisp with the first real chill of autumn. Clara was in a deep, dreamless sleep when a sound pulled her awake. It wasn't loud, but it was wrong. It was a wet, ragged sound, a desperate fight for air that cut through the familiar quiet of the house. In an instant, she was out of bed, her nurse's brain firing before her conscious mind had fully caught up. She didn't need to wonder where the sound was coming from. She found her mother sitting on the edge of her bed, her face pale and tinged with blue in the dim glow of her nightlight. Her breaths were shallow, rapid, and punctuated by a rattling cough that sounded like tearing fabric. Her eyes were wide with a primal fear, pulmonary edema. The diagnosis flashed in Clara's mind, swift and certain. Her mother's lungs were filling with fluid. Her father was standing beside the bed, dressed in his worn flannel pajamas, his hands fluttering uselessly. "Clara, I don't know what's happening," he stammered, his voice thin with panic. "She just woke up like this." Clara didn't waste a second. "Dad, call 911. Tell them it's acute respiratory distress, possible congestive heart failure exacerbation. I'm going to get her oxygen." While her father fumbled with the phone, Clara sprang into action. She grabbed the portable oxygen concentrator they kept for emergencies, her hands moving with practiced speed as she fitted the nasal cannula to her mother's face and turned the dial. She propped her mother up with pillows, forcing her into a sitting position to ease the pressure on her lungs. She spoke in a low, calm monotone, the same voice she used on her most terrified patients. "Okay, Mom, I'm right here. Just focus on your breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Slow and steady, that's it." She was no longer just a daughter. She was a critical care nurse operating in a makeshift ICU. She took her mother's pulse. It was thready and fast. She felt her skin. It was cool and clammy. Every sign pointed to a rapidly escalating crisis. The distant wail of a siren grew closer, a sound of impending rescue. When the paramedics arrived, they found a scene of controlled urgency. Clara was holding her mother's hand, reciting her vital signs and a concise medical history. Female, 76, history of CHF, hypertension. Onset of acute dyspnea approximately 10 minutes ago. Currently on 2 liters of oxygen via cannula. Vitals are... The paramedics, 2 young, focused men, exchanged a look of professional respect. This wasn't the usual panicked family call. They were getting a clean, expert handover. They worked quickly, attaching their own monitors, preparing a stretcher. As they wheeled her mother out into the cold night air, her father grabbed Clara's arm, his knuckles white. His face, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights, was a mask of terror and awe. "Clara," he whispered, his voice cracking, "without you, I don't know what I would have done." For the first time in years, maybe ever, he was looking at her not as the daughter who cooked his meals, but as the woman who had just saved his wife's life. In that chaotic, terrifying moment, under the pulsing lights of the ambulance, Clara felt a flicker of something she hadn't realized she'd been starving for: recognition. It was a fleeting warmth against the cold dread of the night, a silent acknowledgement that her unseen shift had, for once, been seen. The days that followed were a blur of hospital corridors, antiseptic smells, and hushed conversations with doctors. Clara's mother was stable but weak, recovering slowly in the cardiac unit. Her father, lost without his wife and the familiar routines of home, became a shadow at Clara's side, his reliance on her now total and absolute. He looked to her for everything, to translate the medical jargon, to make decisions about care, to simply tell him when to eat and when to sleep. Chris had been notified, of course. He'd expressed his concern in a brief, tense phone call, promising to try and get away as soon as a major deal closed. The unspoken message was clear. The crisis was being managed, and his presence wasn't required. It was on the 3rd day that the request came. A hospital administrator, a woman with a kind but businesslike demeanor, needed to see some older insurance policies and financial records to begin planning for long-term care options. "It's just to get the ball rolling," she explained. "Gently, they're in the safe at home," her father said, his voice raspy with fatigue. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a weary trust she hadn't seen before the night of the siren. He fumbled in his wallet and handed her a small, tarnished brass key. The combination is my birthday. You know it. Clara drove home in the middle of the afternoon. The house felt unnervingly quiet, a silent stage where drama had recently unfolded. The air was stale, and a thin layer of dust was already beginning to settle on the furniture. It was the first time she had been alone there in days, and the silence seemed to amplify the exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones. She walked into her father's small, cluttered office, the room where he paid bills and kept decades of records. The old metal safe was squat and imposing in the corner. With a deep breath, she knelt, the cold of the floor seeping through her scrubs. She turned the dial, the soft clicks echoing in the quiet room, right, left, right. The heavy door swung open with a low groan. The inside smelled of dust and old paper. It was a time capsule of her family's life, birth certificates with tiny inked footprints, old savings bonds from her childhood, the deed to the house. She searched for the insurance folder, her fingers brushing against envelopes of varying ages and textures. Near the back, she felt something different. It was a thick, crisp, legal-sized envelope, its paper stark white against the yellowed documents around it. It was from a local law firm, dated just 6 months ago. A prickle of unease, a cold, formless premonition, ran down her spine. She told herself she was just looking for the insurance papers, but her hands moved with a will of their own. Pulling the envelope from its resting place, she sat on the floor, the envelope in her lap. Her name wasn't on it, but she opened it. Anyway, inside was a legal document bound by a staple. The last will and testament of John and Mary Thompson. Her breath caught. She began to read, the dense, formal language a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil of the past few days. Her eyes scanned the clauses, searching for the familiar architecture of family inheritance. Then she found it. The legal jargon was cold, precise, and absolute. The house, the modest stock portfolio, the entirety of their savings, everything was to be bequeathed to our beloved son, Christopher Thompson. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She read the section again, her mind refusing to process the words. She scanned the rest of the document, a frantic, desperate search for her own name. She found it on the final page in a single devastating clause. To our daughter, Clara May Thompson, in recognition of her devoted care, we leave our unending love and gratitude. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Love and gratitude. It wasn't an inheritance. It was a footnote. It was the pat on the head and the gold watch at the end of a lifetime of service. The fleeting warmth she had felt in the flashing lights of the ambulance, the sense of being truly seen by her father, all of it curdled into a bitter, icy poison. This document was the truth. In the cold, impartial language of the law, her family had finally told her exactly what she was worth. She was not a daughter to be provided for. She was a service to be acknowledged. She sat there on the floor of the silent house, the will clutched in her hand, the foundation of her entire life, reduced to dust. She returned to the hospital that evening, the will folded neatly in the pocket of her scrubs. It felt like a block of ice against her skin, a cold, hard reminder of the truth. She walked through the polished corridors, the familiar squeak of her shoes on the linoleum floor sounding alien and distant. When she entered her mother's room, she found them as she expected, her mother propped up in bed, looking frail against the starched white pillows, and her father sitting in the visitor's chair, reading a newspaper. The television was on, its low murmur filling the silence. They both looked up as she entered, their expressions a mixture of relief and expectation. They were waiting for their caregiver to begin her evening shift. Clara didn't speak. She walked to the side of the bed and pulled the folded document from her pocket. She didn't slam it down. She didn't throw it. She placed it gently on the rolling bedside table, next to a plastic cup of water and a half-eaten bowl of gelatin. The paper lay there, stark and white under the fluorescent lights. Her mother's eyes darted from the document to Clara's face, a flicker of understanding and guilt in their depths. She looked away, focusing on a loose thread on her blanket. It was her father who finally broke the silence, his voice laced with a defensive edge. "What's this, Clara?" "I found it in the safe," she said. Her voice was steady, unnervingly calm. It was the voice she used when delivering bad news to a patient's family, measured, professional, devoid of her own emotion. "I was looking for the insurance papers, as you asked." Her father had the decency to flush, a dark red creeping up his neck. He cleared his throat. "Now, Clara, you have to understand. That's just legal planning. It's about being practical." "Practical," Clara repeated. The word was flat, lifeless. "To leave everything to Chris?" "He's the man of the family," her father said, his voice gaining this self-righteous conviction. He leaned forward as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "He needs a solid foundation, assets to build upon. He'll have a wife and children to provide for one day. It's a son's responsibility to carry on the family name, to build a legacy." Clara's gaze shifted to her mother, who was still intently studying the threads on her blanket, refusing to be a part of the conversation. She was a willing accomplice in her own daughter's erasure. "And what is my responsibility?" Clara asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Her father seemed relieved by the question, as if it were a return to familiar, comfortable ground. "Your responsibility? Your responsibility is what you've always done, dear. You're a good daughter. You have a stable career. Your duty is to care for us. It's what you're good at." There it was. Not a slip of the tongue, but a clear, unvarnished statement of her value. Her duty was to serve. His duty was to inherit. The roles had been assigned long ago, and this will was merely the formal codification of the family's unwritten constitution. The love and gratitude mentioned in the will wasn't a heartfelt sentiment. It was a severance package. It was payment, rendered for a lifetime of service. A profound, chilling clarity washed over Clara. She wasn't angry anymore. The raw, hot pain of betrayal had cooled into something hard and solid, like ice forming in her veins. She looked at these two people, her parents, and saw them for the first time not through the soft focus lens of love and obligation, but through the sharp, unforgiving lens of the truth. She was a utility, a function, a caregiver. Dot, she nodded. Slowly, a single, final acknowledgement. "I see," she said. Dot. She turned without another word and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. She left the will sitting on the table between them, a silent testament to the family she had just lost. The quiet click of the door closing behind her was the sound of a life breaking in two. Asterisk. The call came as Chris was reviewing quarterly projections. On his sleek, glass-top desk. His apartment, 40 stories above the glittering grid of Manhattan, was a testament to order and control. Everything had its place. The leather-bound books arranged by color on the shelves, the single orchid on the windowsill, the faint scent of sandalwood from a discreet diffuser. His life was a series of well-managed assets, and his family, until now, had been one of them, a distant, low-maintenance holding that provided a comforting sense of origin. The shrill, panicked tone of his father's voice was an unwelcome intrusion, a messy, emotional variable in his carefully curated equation. She just walked out. His father said, his voice a frantic squawk over the phone. She put the will on the table and just left. "Your mother is beside herself?" Chris leaned back in his ergonomic chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. He pictured the scene, the sterile hospital room, his parents' bewildered faces, the dramatic, emotional display. It was all so inefficient, so needlessly theatrical. "All right, Dad, calm down," he said, his voice automatically shifting into the smooth, placating tone he used with volatile clients. "Let me handle it." "Put the phone on speaker." He waited, listening to the fumbling and the muffled whispers. "Clara is just being emotional. She's tired, she's stressed. She's not seeing the bigger picture here. I'll talk to her. I'll make her understand." He hung up and immediately dialed his sister's number. He expected her to be crying, or perhaps angry and shouting. He was prepared for either scenario, armed with a logical, step-by-step de-escalation strategy. But the voice that answered was none of those things. It was quiet, steady, and utterly calm. "Hello, Chris." "Clara," he began, letting a note of gentle exasperation enter his voice. "What's all this? Dad just called. You've got them completely worked up. You can't just walk out like that." "I can," she replied. The simplicity of the statement caught him off guard. "Okay, look," he said, shifting gears. "I get it. You saw the will, and it felt personal. But you have to separate the emotion from the strategy. This isn't about who Mom and Dad love. More, this is about asset preservation. It's about ensuring the family's financial legacy is managed effectively. It makes no sense from a tax or growth perspective to split the primary asset. You have your career, your pension. You're stable. I'm in a position to leverage that asset to create greater wealth for the family down the line. It's the logical play." He waited for the tears, the accusations. Instead, there was only silence. For a moment, he thought the call had dropped. "Clara? Are you there?" "I'm here," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the emotional hooks he was searching for. "I heard what you said. Asset preservation, logical play." She repeated his words as if they were artifacts from a foreign language she was examining for the first time. "Exactly," he said, relieved. He was getting through to her. "So, you see, it's not a reflection on you. It's just smart planning. I'm not a part of your plan anymore, Chris." The words were spoken so quietly, he almost missed them. "What does that even mean? You're part of the family." "No," she said, and for the first time, he heard a flicker of something in her voice. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, unshakable finality. "You and Mom and Dad are the family. I was the staff." He let out a short, frustrated laugh. "Oh, come on, Clara. Don't be so dramatic. You're a nurse. It's in your nature to be a caregiver." "You're right," she said. "It is, and a good nurse knows when a system is toxic. A good nurse knows when to walk away before the patient codes." Before he could formulate a response to this bizarre analogy, she said, "Goodbye, Chris." And the line went dead. He stared at his phone, baffled. He had presented a clear, logical argument. He had been reasonable. He had tried to manage her, but she had simply refused to be managed. The neat, orderly lines of his world felt for a moment uncomfortably blurred. He had lost control of an asset, and for the life of him, he couldn't understand why. Annoyed, he placed the phone back on his desk and tried to refocus on the quarterly projections, dismissing the entire messy affair as a temporary emotional glitch. Clara walked out of the hospital's automatic doors and into the cool night air. The city lights, usually a familiar comfort, seemed harsh and indifferent. She didn't go to her car right away. For a moment, she just stood on the pavement, a small, solitary figure in the vastness of the parking lot, and breathed. The air felt different, thinner, sharper. It was the air of a world where she was no longer defined by the needs of others. The grief was still there, a cold, heavy stone in her chest, but it was overlaid with a strange, terrifying sense of lightness. It was the feeling of a prisoner who, after a lifetime of confinement, suddenly finds the cell door unlocked. When she finally got into her car, she didn't drive towards home. The muscle memory of that route, ingrained over thousands of journeys, screamed at her to turn left. Instead, she turned right. She drove aimlessly, her headlights cutting a lonely path through the dark suburban streets. She passed landmarks that had once been the backdrop of her life, the park where she'd learned to ride a bike, the ice cream shop where her father had taken her after she got stitches as a child, the library where she'd discovered a love for reading. Tonight, they were just buildings. They were scenes from someone else's story, a story she had just been written out of dot after an hour of driving. She found herself on the interstate, the city shrinking in her rearview mirror. The rhythmic thrum of the tires on the asphalt was a hypnotic mantra, leaving, leaving, leaving. She wasn't running away. Running implied panic, a frantic escape. This was a departure. It was a deliberate, calculated act of self-preservation. She was a nurse excising a malignancy before it could consume what was left of her dot. Her first stop was a brightly lit, anonymous gas station just off the highway. Inside, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, she bought a cheap prepaid phone and a bottle of water. Back in her car, she took out her smartphone, the device that had for years served as her digital leash. She looked at the screen, at the notifications she had ignored, 3 missed calls from her father, 1 from Chris, and a text message from her mother that simply said, "Please come home." Home. The word had lost all meaning. With a final, decisive movement, she powered the phone down and placed it in the glove compartment. It felt like closing a door on a room she would never enter again. She drove another 20 miles before pulling into the parking lot of a generic roadside motel, the kind with a flickering neon sign that promised vacancy. The room she was given smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner. It was stark and impersonal, with a faded floral bedspread and a television bolted to the wall. It was perfect. It was a space with no history, no expectations, no ghosts. She sat on the edge of the stiff bed, the silence of the room, a stark contrast to the emotional noise of the past few days. The full, terrifying weight of her freedom settled upon her. There was no one to call, no one to check on, no one who needed her. Her time, for the first time since she could remember, was entirely her own. She looked down at her hands, the hands of a caregiver. They had always been busy fluffing pillows, administering medication, holding other hands in comfort. Now they lay still in her lap, empty and waiting. A single tear, hot and unexpected, traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of regret. It was a tear for the woman she had been, the woman who had believed that love and duty were the same. Cling, she wiped it away. The future was a blank, unwritten page, and for the first time in her life, she was the one holding the pen. Asterisk, the first morning without Clara was a study in quiet chaos. Her father, John, awoke to a profound and unsettling silence. There was no gentle clinking of coffee mugs from the kitchen, no soft footsteps on the hallway carpet. The house felt hollow, as if its very heart had been removed. He went to the kitchen to make coffee, a task he hadn't performed in years, and spent 10 minutes searching for the filters before giving up in frustration. His wife, Mary, sat at the kitchen table, a lost look on her face, her unsorted morning pills sitting in a small pile beside her. "Which one is the water pill?" she asked, her voice small. John squinted at the collection of white and pink tablets. To him, they were an indecipherable jumble. Clara had always managed them, her practiced fingers moving with an easy certainty. He fumbled with the bottles, trying to read the tiny print on the labels. "I think it's this one," he said, pushing a small white pill towards her. The uncertainty in his own voice unnerved him. For the first time, he was acutely aware of the thin line they walked every day, a line that Clara had always made. Invisible, the day unraveled from there. The toast was burnt. The milk for their cereal was sour because no one had noticed the expiration date. By noon, The house was a mess of unwashed dishes and crumpled newspapers. The comfortable, orderly world Clara had maintained had disintegrated into a state of low-grade squalor in less than 24 hours. The silence, which had at first felt merely empty, now felt accusatory. Every undusted surface, every unanswered phone call was a testament to their profound helplessness. Finally, in a fit of frustration, John called Chris. "She's really gone," he said, the anger in his voice barely masking a tremor of fear. "The house is a disaster. Your mother needs her medication. What are we supposed to do?" Chris, on the other end of the line in his pristine office, sighed with audible impatience. This was a logistical problem, and logistical problems had solutions. "Dad, relax. I'll handle it. I'll find a home care agency online and have them send someone over. I'll pay for it. Just find one and tell them to send me the bill." It sounded so simple, but when John called the first number on the list, he was met with a barrage of questions he couldn't answer. "What level of care does your wife require? Skilled nursing or companion care? Do you have a power of attorney for healthcare decisions? We'll need to do a full in-home assessment." The cheerful, professional voice on the other end of the line only highlighted his own incompetence. This wasn't like ordering a pizza. It was a complex, bureaucratic process that Clara had always shielded them from. He hung up, more frustrated than before. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The small, daily tasks that Clara had absorbed so seamlessly were now insurmountable obstacles. The grocery shopping, the laundry, the paying of bills online. It was a vast, invisible machinery that had ground to a halt. He looked at his wife, who was staring blankly at the television, a tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. They were adrift in their own home. That evening, they ate canned soup for dinner, sitting in silence in the messy kitchen. The weight of all the things Clara used to do pressed down on them. They weren't just missing her labor. They were missing the buffer she had created between them and the harsh realities of their own decline. They had lost their manager, their advocate, their shield. As John looked around the room at the evidence of their failure, a bitter resentment took root in his heart, eclipsing the fear. It was easier to be angry than to be terrified. "How could she do this to us?" he said, speaking into the quiet room. "After everything we've done for her, how could she be so selfish?" Mary nodded slowly, finding comfort in the familiar narrative of blame. It wasn't their fault. It was Clara's. She had abandoned them. Clara chose Arizona. She'd seen pictures of it in a travel magazine years ago, the vast, sun-drenched landscapes of red rock and endless blue sky calling to a part of her she didn't know existed. She settled in a small town nestled in the Verde Valley, a place where the pace of life was dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, not the relentless ticking of a clock. She took a position at a local community clinic, a world away from the high-stakes pressure of the cardiac ward. Here the crises were smaller, more human. She treated sunburns, tended to children's scraped knees, and managed the chronic conditions of the town's elderly population. For the first time, her work felt like a partnership rather than a one-way street of service. Her patients knew her name. They brought her homemade tamales and asked about her day. Her colleagues were a small, close-knit team who ended their week with a shared beer at the local tavern. They saw her not as a function, but as a person. One afternoon, her manager, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Maria, found Clara staring out the window at the distant red mesas. "You've got the look," Maria said. The look of someone who finally landed where they were supposed to be. Clara realized with a jolt that it was true. Her free time, once a precious, non-existent commodity, now stretched before her, a vast, open landscape of its own. She started hiking. On her first trek, she was clumsy and out of breath. Her city softened. muscles protesting, but she pushed on, driven by a primal need to feel the earth under her feet. She stood at the top of a trail overlooking a canyon, the wind whipping her hair, the silence broken only by the cry of a hawk circling overhead. The world was so big, so ancient. The dramas of her former life, the will, the arguments, the suffocating. Weight of duty seemed small and insignificant under the immensity of that sky. She wasn't just Clara the nurse or Clara the daughter. She was just Clara, a woman standing on a rock under the sun. She made a friend, a woman named Lena, who owned the small pottery studio next to her apartment. Lena was everything Clara. Wasn't loud, expressive, her hands perpetually stained with clay. She didn't ask about Clara's past. Instead, she asked about her favorite color, her opinion on a new glaze, her dreams for the future. They would sit on Lena's dusty porch in the evenings, drinking cheap wine and watching the sky bleed into shades of orange and purple. You were holding your breath for a long time, weren't you? Lena said one evening, shaping a small bowl in her hands. Clara looked at her, surprised. How did you know? I can see it in your shoulders, Lena replied, not looking up. They're finally starting to relax. The grief for her family hadn't vanished entirely. It had changed shape. It was no longer a sharp, open wound, but a faded scar, a reminder of a past she had survived. Sometimes she would feel a pang of guilt, a ghostly echo of her old programming. But then she would remember the cold finality in her father's voice, the dismissive logic in her brother's, and the feeling would recede, replaced by a quiet, steady certainty. She had not abandoned them. They had released her. They had told her, in no uncertain terms, what her value was. And she had simply chosen to believe them and act accordingly. One evening, as she drove home from the clinic, she saw an elderly man stumble on the sidewalk. His son, a man about her age, rushed to his side, steadying him with a gentle hand on his arm, his face a mask of concern and love. For a moment, the old ache returned. But it wasn't for what she had lost. It was a strange, detached pity for the two people in the house she used to call home. They had a daughter who would have done that, 1,000 times over. And they had traded her for an empty house and a son who lived a world away. They had made their choice, and now, finally, so had she. A year passed. The sharp edges of Clara's old life had softened, weathered by the Arizona sun and the steady rhythm of her new existence. The ghost of guilt had long since faded, replaced by a quiet confidence she wore like a second skin. Her friendship with Lena had deepened, and she was tentatively starting to date a kind history teacher who was more interested in her thoughts on the world than in what she could do for him. She had become a fixture at the clinic, a part of the community's fabric. Her life was small, perhaps by the standards her brother lived by, but it was rich, and it was hers. One sweltering afternoon, a thick, formal-looking envelope arrived in her mailbox. It wasn't from her parents or from Chris. The return address was that of a law firm in her old hometown. Her hands were steady as she opened it. The letter was from an estate lawyer, its language professional and devoid of emotion. It informed her, in concise terms, that her father, John Thompson, had passed away peacefully a week prior following a sudden stroke. She sat down on her porch swing, the letter resting in her lap. She felt no shock, no sharp, stabbing grief. Instead, a profound, somber stillness settled over her. She grieved not for the bitter, resentful man her father had become, but for the man he had been long ago, the father who had taught her to ride a bike, whose shoulders she had ridden on. At the county fair, she grieved for the love that had been lost somewhere along the way. The letter continued. Her mother, unable to live alone, had been moved into a full-time nursing facility. The house, the asset they had so carefully preserved for their son, had been sold to pay for the mounting debts of the home care agencies and the facility's exorbitant costs. Chris, after realizing the financial drain was a threat to his own carefully constructed lifestyle, had signed over the necessary paperwork, and the lawyer noted dryly had not attended the funeral, citing a critical business engagement overseas. He had liquidated his inheritance to solve a problem, and then he had moved on. Tucked inside the main envelope was a smaller, personal one. The handwriting on the front was shaky but familiar. It simply said, "For Clara." It was from her. "Father." The estate lawyer noted that it had been found in his bedside table, with instructions to be sent to her upon his death. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside was not a long letter of apology, but a single faded photograph. It was of the two of them from decades ago. She was about 5 years old, sitting on his shoulders, her face alight with pure joy, her small hands tangled in his hair. He was looking up at her, and his expression was one of unadulterated, unconditional love. On the back of the photo, in his familiar scrawl, were just 5 words. "I remember this was real." That was it. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement. A final, desperate message sent from the wreckage of their relationship, a confirmation that before the bitterness and the obligation, there had been something true. The tears that came then were not of anger or of pain, but of a quiet, mournful release. She didn't need to forgive him, not entirely, but she could understand. She could pity a man so trapped by his own rigid ideas of legacy that he had sacrificed the only thing that had ever truly mattered. She never went back. She didn't visit her mother, whose care was now managed by strangers and paid for by the remnants of Chris's inheritance. Her old life was a closed book. That evening, instead of dwelling on the past, she went for a hike with Lena. They climbed to their favorite overlook as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley. "You okay?" Lena asked, her voice gentle. Clara looked out at the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving landscape. She thought of the photograph in her pocket. She thought of the little girl on her father's shoulders and the woman she had become. They were the same person, connected by a thread of quiet strength she was only now beginning to recognize. "I am," Clara said, and the words were the truest she had ever spoken. "I really am." She was at peace. Her legacy wasn't a house or a stock portfolio. It was this quiet strength, this endless sky, this hard-won, precious, and uncheckable peace.